My name's Alex, and I'm going to really be focusing on course evaluation, so a slightly different flavor of research than what the other three talks have focused on. And then specifically, I'm going to really look at how we can use natural language processing on the comments of our course evaluations to gain additional insights. But before I go any further, there we go. I got to put a big disclaimer out there that course evaluations are biased. They just are. Things that have been shown in the literature to be correlated with like the course rating you get, what grade the student got, the perceived race of the professor, how attractive the professor is, whether cookies were available while students were completing evaluations, or even what the weather of the day was when the students were completing these evaluations. All of these things will influence the evaluation that you get. Additionally, I think it's a legitimate question of whether or not students are even good at evaluating teaching. There's a lot of research that says they might not be. And so before I go any further with anything that I'm talking about, I need to have these disclaimers out there. And it's important to note that these are not like separate from CTEX, which is the Northwestern course evaluation that we use. Additionally, there's some other limitations with CTEX. So they are aggregated at the course level. So all of the data I'm going to show you is not individualized. It's all grouped at the course level. So I don't know if one student's comment matches up with another rating, with a specific rating. There's also no measure of how much care each student takes. This is something that's common problem across surveys in general. You'll get the student who goes through and rates everyone 5s and says, we're good to go, without thinking about it again. And you'll get another student who spends like 5-10 minutes on each question, really thinking deeply about what the meaning is. And I have no way of discerning which student is which and weighting appropriately. And just to point out that all these other biases that I mentioned on the last slide exist, just generally this is course ratings across quarters. And there is a bump in the summer, whether that is because summer lecturers are normally full-time lecturers and are more likely to really care about teaching, or that's just that the weather is nicer and everyone's in a better mood. I do not know. So it's important to acknowledge these things. So, are CTEX valuable? Can we gain anything from them? So just to start off, these are the questions that all the CTEX ask, right? It's things like, what's the overall rating of instruction or the overall rating of the course? How much do you learn? In particular, for the rest of these slides, I'm going to focus on these 6, and really most of my things are going to be about the comments and the overall rating of the course. But when we think about if they're valuable, I think a first important test is if there's some expected consistency within them. And so for me, I collected 1,300 CTEX. Has actually came out to be about 28,000 comments that I was able to analyze. I tried to focus on classes relative to the neuroscience major, me being a neuroscience student, but I grabbed full departments as much as I could. So I have a lot of classes from math and biology and psychology. The neuroscience major being such an amalgamation of all these other departments actually ended up in my little other group. But this is sort of where the data is coming from. And when we talk about internal consistency, there's some things you'd expect, right? So instructor rating and course rating are highly correlated. That makes sense. People are rating, when you have a high opinion of the instructor, a high rating of the instructor, you're going to think the course is pretty good. Similarly, nicely, there's also a high correlation in the same positive direction between the amount the student says they learned, rated on that 1 to 6 scale, and the course rating. Also, the interest the student has going into the class and course rating is positively correlated. So all these things say that at least they're consistent within each other. Based on that, there's actually one interesting thing that I found, which is that whether or not a class is required doesn't seem to be correlated with the student's interest in that class going in. And so just sort of explain here, my x-axis is the percentage of students in the class that respond saying that the class was required for their major or for their minor, and then their interest going into the class. And while there is like a negative trend line, the R-squared is so small and that's not a significant correlation. So I think that's interesting that whether or not a class is required does not actually seem to affect a student's interest in it. But the real thing I want to look at, and really what I was wondering is, can we get more detail? Can we get more at the nuance? And that really comes from comments. And as I mentioned, I gathered 28,000 of those, and I was not about to go through those by hand. So that's where natural language processing comes in. So natural language processing, for those who don't know, is a way of using computational methods, programming methods to analyze text and try to extract information from it. Some of the real benefits to it is one, that it's repeatable. So I can do the same analysis over and over on new sets of data, or make small tweaks in the code and rerun it and get new results in minutes rather than weeks or months if someone has to reread each comment. Another big benefit is the volume aspect. Like I said, I went through 28,000 comments. That's a lot, and that's more than I could do on my own, reading them one by one. Natural language processing can produce unexpected ideas because it doesn't have the same biases. No, that's not no biases, but it doesn't have the same biases that humans have going in. You can have different results. And a nice thing that I'm not really going to talk too much about this, but when it comes to those biases, once you've identified them, you can much more easily correct them than trying to correct the bias within human graders. Humans are notoriously hard to change their minds and change their biases. While a program, you can quickly go and write a few lines of code that try to account for it. So to give you a sense of sort of the approach here, this is sort of the pre-processing that all the text went through. So I would get a comment, something like, take advantage of the office hours with Dr. Linsenmeyer. He helped me with a lot of my studying. It would then go through a process called tokenization. Essentially, I'm making all the letters lowercase so that they all look the same. I am breaking up each word. I'm removing all the punctuation. And then I'm doing a couple other clever things here. So one, I'm creating what's called bigrams. So you can see office hours is joined together. Basically, there's a way programmatically to look for words that are commonly right after each other, two words that are normally in pairs, and made them one solid thing. So the word office and the word hours are different words that do get used throughout, but the word office hours is its own thing, which makes a lot of sense. Another common one you see in these sorts of comments is the term extra credit. I also went and replaced all names that I could find with the variable prof name. I did this for a couple of reasons. One, for privacy reasons, to respect all the professors' privacies, but also because I think it is valuable, and as I'll show, comes out to be valuable, that someone refers to a professor by name. I did the same thing for departments. So there's a depth name variable that you'll see sometimes, and it's the same idea. So rather than having math or chemistry or something like that, neuroscience pop up, it's going to have that depth name instead. So the first thing I went and looked at is something called polarity. Polarity is how positive or negative a comment is. So you can see it's on a score from -1 to 1, and you can see comments like, it was the best seminar with the best professor. It gets a score of 1. Well, something like, this course is so boring, basically just need to memorize his notes before the exams, is a score of -1. And looking at sort of how that relates to course rating, we see a very nice positive correlation again. A couple things to note, that because the course and course ratings are aggregated at the course level, I actually aggregated the comment polarities at the course level. I just took the mean polarity across all the comments for a course. Additionally, it's nice to point out that the polarity itself is actually skewed. So like I said, the polarity scores are rated on a scale from -1 to 1, but of all the courses that I have, only one had a negative mean score really of any significance. And so that tends to speak to the fact that people don't like to write mean things. They like to put a positive spin on it. Even their criticism tends to be in a positive way. The other and the more interesting thing I think that I looked at was what's called topics. And so I used topic modeling, which is a computational method to identify topics in text. Basically, I took that lemmatized text that's got the tokens, it's been simplified, and I created what's called dictionaries. They count the frequency of each word in each comment. I then weighted those words so that words like course or class, which are common across all of the comments, get down-weighted, while some other words that might be unique to each comment get a little uprated. And then I use an algorithm called LDA, which looks for groups of words that are commonly placed together. And the nice thing about this is unsupervised. So it knows nothing about the words it's placing. It just sees that word 1, 15, and 37 are normally in a comment together. So we're going to define those. And so it pulled out 6 different topics for me. You can see word clouds of them here. The size of the word is related to the weight or the importance of that word in a topic. The two that I want to call your attention to are the professor personal, right? So these are when people really use the professor's name and had a lot of good things to say about the professor. And then also the difficulty topic, which is interesting to me because it's actually doesn't have a polarity. It's both hard and easy courses, or the words hard and easy are both equally common almost in these. So the difficulty isn't speaking to whether or not a course is difficult, but just talking about how difficult a course is. And we look at the relationship to course rating. Like I said, those two topics in particular, but all the topics in general have some interesting things. So again, these are aggregate at the course level. So each topic got assigned whatever the most common or the primary topic of it. And then the most common topic amongst all the course's comments is what that course got assigned to. And the personal professor really comes out on top, whereas that difficulty one really has a much lower rating than some of the others. So that's kind of interesting just to see. Since I'm short on time here, let's go quickly. So what can we learn? So at least they are internally consistent, so they might have some value from that, rather than even with all of the biases and disclaimers I have to put there. Interesting, whether or not a class required doesn't seem to impact the student's interest in it. And then comments can really be used to provide some additional nuance. So things like polarity, so how positive a comment is, does seem to be related to what people think. Mentioning of a name is a really good thing. So really try to have that personal connection so that students are comfortable using your name. And additionally, look out for comments that focus on interest or in difficulty. They tend to have these more negative things, which is kind of interesting. Next steps, I'd like to pull in more CTECs, more departments, and see what sort of general things can be applied to other aspects. I'd like to start trying to address some of the issues with course evaluations by looking at other metrics of teaching success. I want to explore outliers, so times when a comment or the primary topic of a comment might be on difficulty, but the course actually has a really high rating, or they might have used their name, but they have a really low rating. What's going on there? And then finally, using this to identify and try to correct biases. There's been some work using these sort of methods to identify biases in gender biases in particular. People tend to describe professor as funnier. They describe male professor as funnier than women professors. And so things like that you can try to incorporate. But yeah, with that, I just want to say thank you and hand it back off to Lauren.